They fined me $5,000 for hunting, so I bought the forest they hike in and banned them from ever stepping foot on it again. Let that sink in. This story isn't fiction. It happened right here in a quiet HOA-run suburb in western Washington state, where a war wasn't fought with weapons, but with bylaws, blind arrogance, and one man's determination to protect what was his. But before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Do you live in an HOA? Ever had a nightmare rule or a power-tripping board member? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Because if this could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. And now, let me tell you how it all began. I never imagined a single sheet of paper could ignite a war. Not the kind with guns and flags, but a quieter, more insidious battle, the kind that creeps into your mailbox, hides in polite smiles, and calls itself community standards. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, sharp and deliberate. I opened the door, coffee in hand, and there stood Diane Carter, the president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, holding a beige envelope and a look that said she'd already won. "I'm here to inform you of a violation," she said crisply, holding out the paper. "According to Article 14.6 of the Community Guidelines, unauthorized hunting has taken place on association-managed land. A $5,000 fine is being issued, payable within 30 days. I took the notice from her, glanced at the heading in bold, notice of violation, unauthorized hunting, $5,000 penalty. I didn't get angry. I smiled. Diane blinked, caught off guard by the reaction. She was expecting fear, maybe indignation, certainly not calm amusement. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this flimsy document didn't put me in check. It flipped the board. My name is Jack Monroe, 40 years old, former Marine, now a remote software engineer specializing in cybersecurity. I live alone, prefer trees to traffic, and believe in two things above all else: the value of personal freedom and the sanctity of private property. I moved to Silver Pines for the same reason a lot of people my age do. I wanted peace. After 15 years bouncing between war zones and server rooms, I was tired of artificial noise. Silver Pines promised serenity. Modern homes with oversized lots, nestled at the edge of a lush Oregon woodland. It was the kind of place real estate agents call exclusive and retired professionals call ideal. What they didn't mention was that living in paradise came with a price tag beyond the $500 quarterly HOA fees. It came with rules, dozens of them: lawn height, garage color, fence materials, and most importantly, it came with Diane Carter. I'd met her once before, shortly after moving in. She brought a welcome basket, heavy on paperwork and light on actual welcomes. The folder she handed me had Silver Pines Community Code embossed on the front in gold foil. Inside, 47 pages of restrictions, bylaws, and enforcement procedures. "We're so pleased to have a new resident," she'd said, smiling without warmth. "I'm sure you'll find everything runs quite smoothly here, as long as everyone does their part." I'd nodded politely, but in my head, a quiet alarm had gone off. Still, I tried to stay under the radar. I paid my dues, kept my lawn trimmed, and never showed up at the monthly HOA meetings. Local gossip called them Diane's sermons. I had no interest in conflict. I just wanted space, silence, and the freedom to walk into the woods on a Saturday morning with my gear and my thoughts. That weekend had been perfect for hunting. Fog drifted low through the trees, the air cold and clean. I crossed the boundary between our community and the adjacent forest, a vast, uninhabited stretch of land that had no signs, no fences, and no claim markers. I'd done my homework. The land was owned by an elderly man named Frank Milner, now living in Florida. I'd emailed him weeks earlier to ask for permission to hunt on his property. He replied the next day, "Go right ahead, son. I haven't set foot on that land in years. Just be safe. And if you get a good buck, send me a photo." So I did. What I didn't know was that Diane and her friends had been using that same forest for their morning wellness walks for over a decade. They'd carved trails, placed benches, even hung bird feeders without ever seeking permission from the owner. To them, It was theirs in everything but law. That's why, when Diane stumbled upon me, cleaning a deer in a forest clearing, she reacted like I'd just committed sacrilege in her private chapel. "This is a protected area," she screamed, pulling out her phone. "Who gave you permission to murder animals here?" I tried to explain, but she wouldn't hear it. She took photos. She called me barbaric. And 3 days later, that envelope landed on my doorstep. They thought it would scare me. They thought I'd cave. But that paper wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. I didn't move to Silver Pines to pick a fight. I came for the same reasons most people do: space, peace, and the quiet luxury of not being noticed. After serving 2 tours overseas and a decade in tech hell, I wanted a place where my neighbors waved but didn't pry, where trees outnumbered people, and where no one gave a damn if I grilled a steak at midnight. Silver Pines seemed to fit the bill. On paper, it was everything I wanted: tree-lined streets, mountain views, modern craftsman homes spaced far enough apart to breathe. The realtor bragged about award-winning community landscaping and an active but respectful HOA. That last bit should have raised a red flag, but like a lot of folks, I brushed it off. They're just there to keep things tidy. I remember telling myself, that was before I met Diane Carter, the first time I saw her. She was wearing pastel slacks and a coral blouse that looked like it came straight out of a yacht catalog. Her hair didn't move in the wind. She carried herself like a judge in her own courtroom. "I brought you a little something," she said, extending a basket that smelled of potpourri and vague disappointment. Inside was a mason jar of local honey, a candle shaped like an acorn, and a thick spiral-bound packet with the words Silver Pines Community Code, 2021 edition, emblazoned in gold foil. "We value order and unity here," she said, smiling without blinking. "This guide will help you become a great neighbor." That was Diane in a nutshell: polite, polished, and terrifying. I flipped through the packet later that night. It read less like a guidebook and more like a manifesto. Pages upon pages of codes: how high your grass could be, the acceptable color range for garage doors, earth tones only, regulations about parking your own car in your own driveway overnight, prohibited unless pre-approved, even the mandatory curtain colors for street-facing windows. It was comical at first, until I realized they were dead serious. The Silver Pines Homeowners Association wasn't a community, it was a kingdom. And Diane, she was the queen. HOA meetings weren't discussions, they were sermons. Residents showed up mostly to nod along or avoid being singled out. Few ever voted, fewer still dared to oppose her. What bothered me wasn't the rules themselves, it was who enforced them and why. I'm no anarchist. I understand community standards, but there's a legal boundary and it matters. According to RCW 6438-20, which governs homeowners associations in Washington state, a homeowners association shall have no authority over property not expressly included in its governing documents or covenants. Revised Code of Washington, RCW 6438-020. That single line would become my shield later. But at the time, I filed it away quietly, like a soldier marking enemy positions before the attack. The only friendly face. Not everyone in Silver Pines bowed to Diane. There was one exception, Karen Alvarez, a retired postal worker who lived across the street and hated confrontation even more than I did. But one evening, as I was out fixing a sagging section of my fence, she wandered over. "You're new," she said, "which means Diane's already labeled you either useful or problematic." I laughed. "What happens if I'm neither?" She smirked. "That's not an option in Silver Pines." Over time, she'd tell me stories about residents fined for leaving Christmas lights up too long, or for parking a U-Haul on their driveway for an extra 12 hours. One man got fined for planting roses because they weren't native enough. "She wants a postcard," Karen told me. "And anyone who smudges the corners gets written up." That postcard was starting to feel more like a trap. Behind Silver Pines lay about 80 acres of woodland. No signs, no trails on the official community map. I asked around, no one knew much, except that people liked walking there. On weekends, I'd see small groups of joggers and dog walkers disappearing into the trees. Curious, I looked up the property records. The land belonged to Frank Milner, an 83-year-old widower living in Florida. The record hadn't changed hands in decades. A few emails later, and I had written permission to walk, camp, and hunt there so long as I was respectful. Just don't shoot the birds, Frank joked. My wife loved chickadees. What neither Frank nor I knew was that Diane had been using Frank's land as a marketing tool for Silver Pines for years. She called it the Pines Preserve during open house tours. She'd even added it to the community's promotional flyers with phrases like private trails for residents only. But there was nothing private about it, at least not for her HOA. This wasn't just overreach, it was appropriation. That weekend, I loaded up my gear at 5:30 a.m. and headed into the woods. The air was sharp with November cold. Frost sparkled on fallen leaves. I found a quiet clearing, set up, and waited. By 9:00, a clean buck stepped into range. One shot, quick, humane. Just as I'd been taught back in Wyoming by my grandfather, I approached the deer to field dress it. Then I heard them, voices, laughter, sneakers crunching leaves, and then her. Diane emerged from the trees like a phantom, flanked by 3 other women dressed in matching yoga outfits in outrage. She stopped dead when she saw me kneeling over the deer. What is this?" she gasped. "This is barbaric. You're hunting in a protected area." "It's not protected," I said calmly. "It's private, and I have written permission." Her phone was already up. Snap, snap, snap. "Expect a fine," she said, and I did. But I also expected something else, a reckoning. 3 days after the deer incident, I came home from a grocery run to find a thick envelope taped to my front door. The paper was folded perfectly, like it had been pressed under a law book overnight. On the outside, in bold lettering, it read, "Notice of violation. Immediate attention." Required inside was a multi-page document printed on the cream-colored letterhead with the HOA's insignia at the top. My name was spelled correctly. The tone was not threatening, it was surgical, clinical, emotionless. "You are hereby cited for the following violations of the Silver Pines Community Code, Section 14(6), engaging in harmful recreational activity on or adjacent to protected community land. Section 9.3, causing psychological distress to residents via display of violence, hunting imagery. Section 3.1, disruption of community harmony. The fine $5,000 due within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in further legal measures, including potential lien on property under Silver Pines Enforcement Resolution 2020-01. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I recognized it for what it was, an intimidation tactic. A bluff wrapped in legal formatting, designed to pressure me into submission. But they made a mistake. They forgot who I used to be. I called a friend of mine from my military days, Leah Tran, now a real estate attorney based in Portland. Smart as hell, sharp as a scalpel, and allergic to bullies. She answered on the second ring. "Jack Monroe," she said. "I assume you're calling because someone made a very stupid mistake." "Damn right," I said, and gave her the rundown. She asked for photos of the notice and the HOA documents, including the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions and restrictions that govern Silver Pines. I scanned and sent them all within the hour. 30 minutes later, she called me back. Her voice was dry, amused. "You're gonna love this," she said. "They have zero legal basis for that. Fine. How sure are you?" "Dead sure." I pulled up RCW 64.38.020 from Washington's HOA laws. She explained, "Their authority ends where their property line does. That forest isn't part of Silver Pines. They have no jurisdiction over it. You weren't even near HOA-maintained space." She paused. "And that psychological distress claim, that's not a legal argument. That's a toddler whining." Legal note, RCW 6438, powers of a homeowners association. An association may exercise powers and take actions with respect to the property owned or maintained by the association. The association has no authority to enforce restrictions beyond its jurisdiction, as defined in its governing documents. Revised Code of Washington. I took her advice seriously. Instead of reacting, I started documenting. I wrote a formal rebuttal letter, citing both my hunting license and the written permission I had from Frank Milner, the legal landowner. Leah helped me phrase it just right. Not emotional, just legal, precise. But what really pushed me over the edge wasn't the fine, it was the whispers. That weekend, I noticed the difference. Neighbors who used to nod now avoided eye contact. The woman who jogged past my house every morning crossed to the other side of the street. Even Karen Alvarez, my one-time ally, looked visibly uncomfortable waving hello. It got worse when Sarah Alvarez, the local school teacher who lived 3 doors down, texted me, FYI, Diane mentioned at the school board mixer that you were an unstable individual with military PTSD who brought guns into the woods behind the homes. Be careful, she's poisoning the well. That one hit harder than the fine. Diane wasn't just trying to scare me. She was trying to destroy my reputation. That night, I pulled out the HOA meeting schedule. There was one set for Thursday 3 days from now, time to step out of the shadows. I didn't plan on speaking, not at first. I figured I'd sit quietly, observe, and pass out copies of my documents during the community concerns segment at the end. But the moment I walked into the community center, all eyes turned toward me like I'd walked in covered in blood. About 20 residents were seated around folding tables. At the front, Diane, flanked by 2 HOA board members. On her right was Tom Eldridge, the treasurer, a soft-spoken retiree who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. On her left was Marcus Bell, vice president and Diane's bulldog, clean-cut, gym-toned, and allergic to independent thought. Diane didn't waste time. Well, Mr. Monroe, she said as I took a seat near the back, perhaps you'd like to explain to the community why you were slaughtering wildlife in our protected woodland. Her tone was saccharine. Her eyes were ice. I stood up slowly, holding a manila folder, calm, professional, dead center. I'd be happy to clarify. I said, first, the land is not part of Silver Pines, as per both county property maps and the HOA's own documentation. Second, I had written permission from the landowner, which I've brought copies of. Third, I was hunting legally, in season, with a valid permit. Fourth, I let the silence build. The HOA has no jurisdiction to fine anyone for activity conducted outside its property lines. I walked to the table and set down my folder, printed copies of my hunting license, Frank Milner's permission email, satellite maps showing the land in question was outside HOA bounds. A highlighted section of RCW 6438.020. Silence followed, then murmurs. Tom Eldridge adjusted his glasses. He started flipping through the papers, his brows rising. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Diane's smile tightened. But she wasn't done yet. Those trails have been part of our community for over a decade, Diane said, voice firm but rising in pitch. We've maintained them, improved them. Our residents hike there every morning. That land may not be on our official deed, but in spirit, it's part of Silver Pines. In spirit isn't legally binding, I said calmly. I understand people have memories there, but that doesn't give this association legal authority to fine me or to act like it owns property it doesn't. Her jaw tightened. Intent matters, she said. Not in property law. It doesn't, I replied, and turned toward the room. I served 2 tours overseas. I've seen what happens when people confuse sentiment with sovereignty. That struck a chord. A few people shifted in their seats. Tom Eldridge looked down at his notes, suddenly unsure of what he was supposed to believe. Even Marcus avoided eye contact. Jack, Diane said, forcing a smile again, we're not trying to attack you. This is just about community standards. You can understand how disturbing it must be for our residents to see a dead animal so close to their homes. The forest is 400 yards from the nearest backyard, I said. And let's be clear, no laws were broken. You're trying to punish me because you're used to getting your way. But HOA regulations stop at the property line, and I've got both the law and the landowner's permission on my side. Legal note, Washington law is clear without a formal easement or ownership. Repeated use of someone else's land does not create automatic rights. you'd need 10 years of continuous hostile and exclusive use, plus tax payments, to even attempt a claim under adverse possession. Jack, referencing RCW 728-050. Diane stiffened. Are you accusing the HOA of trespassing? I paused for a moment, then met her eyes. Not yet. Gasps rippled through the room. A few murmurs. For the first time, I could feel it cracks forming in Diane's hold. Her voice faltered slightly when she spoke next. Well, this isn't the place to resolve legal interpretations. If you choose not to pay the fine, we'll escalate it through the enforcement clause. The board has already voted unanimously, and that would be a mistake, I said, because I'll challenge it in court. And when I do, your entire board will be forced to justify why you attempted to fine a resident for actions on land you don't own. I gathered my documents and left the folder on the table. I'm not looking for a fight, I added, but I won't roll over for one, either. A community divided. Later that night, Sarah Alvarez knocked on my door, a six-pack of beer in hand and a worried look on her face. That was intense, she said, sinking into the chair on my porch. You handled it better than I could have. But be careful. Jack, Diane doesn't like being contradicted, especially not in front of others. She made it personal. I said, she's not running an HOA, she's running a fiefdom. Sarah nodded. Most of us know that, but nobody wants to speak up. Not after what happened to the Halversons. I frowned. Who couple from 2 streets over complained about the new landscaping assessments last year. Suddenly they got fined for incomplete gutter cleaning and failure to label garbage bins properly. Then there were whispers about them being anti-community. Their kid got left off the softball team. They moved 2 months later. That pissed me off more than the fine. This isn't a neighborhood, I said. It's a gated power structure. Sarah sipped her beer. The gates are invisible. But yeah. The trail of assumptions. The next day, I drove to the county assessor's office. I requested the plat maps and deed history for the 80-acre woodland behind Silver Pines. The clerk, a tired-looking man named Leonard, didn't ask questions. He just pulled up the record. Owner Frank H., Milner status private property, undeveloped taxpayer Milner Family Trust, Sarasota. FL no easements, no development permits on file, clear as day. But what caught my eye was something else, a request from Silver Pines HOA, dated just 4 months prior, asking about future zoning compatibility for a potential nature preserve adjacent to the community. They hadn't asked Frank. They hadn't tried to buy the land. They were planning something bigger, and they didn't want the owner to know. I took photos of the documents and drove home, head buzzing. I sent a follow-up email to Frank. This time, I was direct Mr. Milner. Has anyone from Silver Pines HOA ever contacted you regarding the use, development, or sale of your land, I ask, because the HOA has cited me for hunting on your property, claiming it as part of the community. Just want to clarify before I take further steps. He replied within the hour, absolutely not. Never heard from them. If they're using my land for anything, it's without my say-so. That's not okay. I stared at the screen. So, they were trespassing. They were using his land as a community feature, potentially raising property values, promoting it in real estate flyers, and they didn't even bother asking permission. I called Leah. This could get big, she said after hearing the update. If they've been developing or advertising use of private property, and they've collected funds under that assumption. We're not just talking about fines anymore. That could qualify as misrepresentation or even fraud. I exhaled slowly. Then it's time we found out how far down this rabbit hole goes. By the time the HOA sent me a second notice this time, threatening additional fees and a lien on my home, I'd already made my decision. I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to go on offense. Quiet preparations. Leah and I started documenting everything. Every letter, every notice. Every social media post from Silver Pines' private Facebook group that hinted at my aggression. Sarah, my closest ally in the neighborhood, sent me screenshots of Diane's public comments referring to me as a safety concern and potentially unstable. It was textbook character assassination. At Leah's suggestion, I installed trail cameras on the woodland perimeter, Not just for wildlife, but to see who was using the land. Within 3 days, the footage showed dozens of residents entering and exiting the forest through unofficial paths, morning yoga groups, joggers, dog walkers, even children playing near makeshift tree swings. None of them had any idea they were on land that didn't belong to the HOA, and that was the problem. The realtor's lie. What sealed it for me was the brochure. A neighbor who worked in real estate, quietly sympathetic to my situation, slipped a folder under my door one evening. Inside was a professionally printed marketing packet titled, "Welcome to Silver Pines, Nature, Peace, and Private Trails." It featured photos of the forest behind the community. A full-page spread highlighted a hand-drawn map showing trails and picnic spots all on Frank Milner's land. No attribution, no disclaimer. It was as if the HOA had simply absorbed it through wishful thinking. And the final straw, a placeholder rendering of a future development project, the Diane Carter Nature Preserve, coming 2024. My jaw clenched. This wasn't about community, this was about legacy, ego, control, and fraud. Contacting Frank, I called Frank again. "You were right to ask," he said over the phone, voice tired but sharp. "They've never reached out, never paid a cent. I've been handling the property taxes myself. You're telling me they're using my land in their marketing." "Yes, sir, and it looks like they're planning to develop it." Silence. "I've had that land for over 50 years, he said. "It was my father's before me. But I'm 83 now. I can't walk anymore. My kids don't want it. To be honest, I've been thinking of selling, just haven't gotten around to it." I took a breath, then, carefully. "If you were serious about selling, I'd be interested." "You..." "Yes. I've lived here for a year. I'm the one who asked permission. I've respected the land, and I intend to keep it that way. But I also want to stop these people from exploiting it." Frank chuckled. Now that's the kind of man I'd sell to. We agreed to discuss details. I told Leah. She lit up. "If you buy that land, Jack, you don't just win the argument. You flip the whole power dynamic. They think they can bully you. You'll become the legal owner of everything they've misused." Due diligence. We ran a title search, checked for liens, easements nothing, clean title, no encumbrances, Frank was sole owner, and the taxes were fully paid. We drafted a letter of intent, and Leah contacted a local title company. Frank's asking price was $800,000 steep, but negotiable. With some back and forth, he agreed to $745,000 cash deal. I had most of it, some from savings, some from a small inheritance my grandfather left me when he passed. It wasn't how I planned to spend it, but somehow, I knew he'd approve. "Always protect what's yours," he used to say, "and always respect what ain't." The smear campaign. While we worked on the sale, the HOA escalated. I got a third notice this one, citing non-compliance with community ethics, whatever that meant. Then came the social campaign, a neighborhood post asking, "Should violent hobbyists be allowed near our children?" Neighbors I barely knew began posting passive-aggressive remarks online. Some people moved to a peaceful neighborhood just to ruin it. We need to take back our community from outsiders who don't share our values. A few were bolder. I found a printed flyer taped to my trash bin. "No place for killers in Silver Pines." It would have stung if I hadn't already seen what was coming. The turning point. The day I signed the purchase agreement with Frank was the day everything changed. Amanda from the title company called to confirm the deed transfer. The 80 acres of forest officially became mine. That night, I printed out a copy of the new deed and placed it in a leather folder. Then I waited. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. the next morning, there was a knock at the door. Diane, perfectly dressed, standing with Marcus at her side. "I assume you've reconsidered," she said sweetly. "You can still pay the fine today, and we'll drop the lien proceedings." I smiled and stepped aside. "Actually, I've got something for you." In the living room, I opened the folder and laid out the deed to the forest land, now in my name. County maps marking the exact boundaries, photos of the unauthorized trails, benches, signs all on my land. Diane's face went pale. Marcus turned crimson. This can't be right," she whispered. That land has been used by Silver Pines for years. I nodded, used, but never owned, never taxed, never legally accessed. You can't just cut us off. Oh, but I can, I said, voice calm but hard, and I will. Effective immediately. All HOA-related activities on my property are to cease. Any structures, benches, signs, remove them, or I'll press trespassing charges. And the park, Marcus asked, his voice cracking. I slid over one more document, a cease and desist letter from Leah, citing unauthorized development on private land and potential misrepresentation of HOA authority in public fundraising materials. Diane's hand shook as she read it. You've made a huge mistake, she hissed. I leaned forward, holding her gaze. No, you did. You built a monument to your ego on land that didn't belong to you. I'm just the one holding the deed. The war had just begun. As they left my house in silence, I knew they'd be regrouping. Diane wasn't finished, not by a long shot. She'd built her identity on power. Losing it would make her dangerous. But I had two things she didn't. 1, the law on my side. 2, and now the land under her feet. By the afternoon of the deed transfer, Silver Pines was buzzing. News spreads fast in small neighborhoods. News about power shifting spreads even faster. Sarah texted me at 3:41 p.m. emergency HOA meeting tonight. Everyone's talking. Diane is panicking. I didn't reply. I just stood at the edge of my new land, watching a pair of HOA-branded volunteers in khaki vests yank one of the Silver Pines nature trail signs out of the ground and scurry back toward the subdivision like they were fleeing a crime scene. For over a decade, this community had treated private property as public asset without permission, paperwork, or payment. And the queen who ruled it all, she had built her power on a carefully controlled illusion that she and the HOA owned everything they touched, even when they didn't. Now the illusion was broken, and Diane Carter was scrambling to pick up the shards. The meeting of fear. The community center that evening was standing room only. Retirees in windbreakers, suburban couples in fleece, even a few teenagers playing on their phones. I stood in the back, arms crossed, saying nothing. Diane took the floor with unshakable poise, hair immaculate, blouse crisp, tone almost motherly. We've called this emergency meeting to address a situation that affects the very heart of Silver Pines, she began. Mr. Monroe has recently acquired the land we've all come to love, the very forest that defines our community's character. She paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the room. It is true that some of our walking trails extend into that property, but that land has been used for community enjoyment for over 10 years. And now, unfortunately, we are facing restrictions, fences, and signs that threaten to divide, not unite our neighborhood. I could practically hear the spinning. She continued, her voice softer now, a tone of faux sadness. We're not here to assign blame. We're here to reaffirm our values. Silver Pines has always stood for togetherness, for access, for shared beauty. I wanted to laugh. Togetherness. This was the woman who fined a veteran for storing a kayak in his side yard, who once cited a family for installing a non-HOA approved swing set, who punished anything unapproved, unregulated, or unsanctioned by her rulebook. And now she wanted to talk about unity. A community begins to question. A man near the front stood up. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, HOA badge on his windbreaker. Diane. With all due respect, did the HOA ever have formal access to that land? There it was. The first crack. Diane smiled tightly. We have used the land openly, peacefully, and continuously for over a decade. But that's not the question, the man said. Did we ever get the owner's permission? Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, I donated $2,000 to the Nature Trail Fund. Was that for land we didn't even own? Diane's expression didn't flinch, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped the lectern. The fundraising was for maintenance, beautification, and exploratory planning. No funds have been misused, she said carefully. All expenses have been documented and are publicly available to any HOA member upon request. I made a mental note of that last sentence. Sarah turned to me and whispered, "You're shaking the whole tree. Jack." "Good," I whispered back. "The map that shouldn't exist." The next morning, I paid a visit to the city records office. If Diane and the HOA had been working on development plans for the land they didn't own, there would be a paper trail. And sure enough, there was. I requested public zoning and permit applications filed in the past 18 months. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow when he saw the name Silver Pines HOA listed 4 times. Each filing listed land adjacent to Silver Pines subdivision as the intended site. But one in particular stood out: project name, Carter Nature Preserve Development Proposal. Applicant Silver Pines Homeowners Association, consulting firm, Green Vision Civic Design. LLC Phase DOA, a funding $38,000 raised through community donation campaigns, permit status pending environmental review, and the attached map. It traced every inch of my land, not Frank's, mine. Trails, benches, signage, even a proposed stone arch at the forest entrance labeled the Carter Legacy Arch, Est, 2024. I snapped photos of every page, every signature, every line item. The HOA had officially submitted plans to develop land they didn't own, using money raised from residents under false pretenses. And the consulting firm, owned by Trevor Carter, Diane's husband. Yes, the real question. When I returned home, I sat on my porch, laptop open, documents spread out like evidence at a trial. If this had just been about power, maybe Diane could have spun it. Maybe she could have convinced the community that I was selfish or anti-neighborhood. But this was paper, money, misrepresentation. A development scheme sold to the public as community improvement, but secretly orchestrated to build Diane's name into stone, literally, and funnel money into her family's business. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a scam. The deeper I looked, the uglier it got. By the end of the week, I had confirmed 3 things. Orestos. 1. The Silver Pines HOA had submitted at least 2 grant applications for park development, both based on land they didn't own. 2. The consulting firm hired to handle design and environmental planning was Green Vision Civic Design, registered to Trevor Carter, Diane's husband. 3. The project budget, totaling over $75,000 in community-raised funds, had been approved solely by the HOA executive board with no community vote. The numbers didn't lie, but someone had to explain where that money went. The flash drive. On Saturday morning, I received a text from an unknown number: "Meet me tomorrow, 11 a.m., outside of Red Maple Cafe. Don't bring anyone. I'll bring what you need." At first, I thought it was a prank. Then came the second message: "Diane doesn't know I kept backups. But I won't let her bury this." I showed the text to Leah. She narrowed her eyes. "You think it's someone from inside?" "Has to be." Leah nodded. "Then go. But be smart. Record everything. And don't take your eye off the door." Nancy's truth. At 10:55 the next morning, I parked outside the Red Maple Cafe and took a seat on the patio. I brought my phone, a voice recorder, and a small camera pen clipped to my collar. At 11:03, a woman in her early 40s stepped out of a silver sedan and walked up nervously. She wore a navy cardigan, her brown hair in a simple bun, eyes darting like someone afraid of being seen. Nancy Roberts, HOA secretary, soft-spoken, always in Diane's shadow. "Mr. Monroe," she said, barely above a whisper. "Jack," I said gently. "Please, sit." She glanced behind her, then sat down across from me. Her hands trembled. "I don't have much time," she said, sliding a small flash drive across the table. "This has the financial ledgers, meeting minutes, vendor contracts. I copied them all over the past year. Just in case." In case of what? In case someone finally stood up to her. The tip of the iceberg. The data on that flash drive was explosive. Leah and I stayed up late going through every file. Over $68,000 in payments from the HOA's Community Enhancement Fund had been routed directly to Green Vision Civic Design. Every invoice was signed by Diane, approved by Marcus, and marked board authorized, no vote required. One invoice billed $900 to $500 for rendering updates an image of a forest trail that looked suspiciously like a photo lifted from Google Street View. Another $200 was marked for soil stability assessment, no receipts, no report. "This is procurement fraud," Leah muttered. "No bids, no transparency, direct payment to a family-owned vendor. If she were in public office, she'd already be indicted, and she thinks this won't catch up to her. She's banking on fear and silence." But Nancy hadn't stayed silent. Whistleblower in waiting. That week, I met Nancy again, this time in the back of a bookstore 2 towns over. I was scared, she admitted. Diane controls everything. She's friends with the school superintendent, with 2 council members. Her husband's firm does work for the city. You think she'll come after you? I know she will. But I can't be part of it anymore. Nancy had joined the HOA board 5 years ago, back when it was mostly about gardening decisions and noise complaints. Then Diane got elected. She started pushing legacy projects, said we needed to make Silver Pines a model for other communities. She convinced the board to create the Carter Nature Preserve Fund, claimed it was technically legal since the land was undeveloped and unused, but no vote, no owner permission. Nancy shook her head. She said the owner was irrelevant, that with enough time, we'd get adverse possession anyway. The law on their side? Until it wasn't, Leah helped me formalize the next steps. We filed a public records request for HOA filings, contracts, and internal communications. We contacted the county zoning office and alerted them to possible fraud in the permit applications. And then, we prepared the letter. It was addressed to all Silver Pines residents, HOA board members, the County Ethics Committee, and the State Attorney General's HOA Oversight Division. Attached was a full summary: the fake nature preserve, the misappropriated donations, the fraudulent filings, and, most damning of all, the conflict of interest between Diane and her husband's company. At the bottom of the letter was a simple sentence: "I'm not asking for retribution. I'm asking for accountability and transparency. For all of us, Jack Monroe." The calm. Before the firestorm. I gave Nancy the option to remain anonymous. She refused. If this is how I lose my spot on the board, so be it. I'd rather be unemployed than complicit. Sarah offered to deliver letters to every mailbox. Leah submitted a formal complaint to the state board. I sat on my porch that night and waited for the storm. It didn't take long. At 7:13 p.m., my phone buzzed. Sarah Diane just stormed out of the clubhouse. Marcus followed. No meeting tonight. Everyone's freaking out. At 7:38 p.m., Nancy texted me. Trevor Carter cleared out his files from the HOA office. He looked scared, not angry, scared. By 9:00 p.m., the Silver Pines Facebook group shut down due to ongoing legal inquiries. And by midnight, I received a knock at the door. A man I'd never met stood on my porch. 60s, calm, measured voice. "Name's Robert Jackson," he said. "Used to be on the HOA board. I think it's time someone told you what really happened 10 years ago." Robert Jackson looked nothing like a revolutionary, khaki windbreaker, pressed jeans, orthopedic shoes. The kind of man you'd expect to see feeding ducks at the park, not carrying the key to unraveling a decade-long scheme. But when he sat across from me at the kitchen table, something in his eyes told me this wasn't the first time he'd tried to fight back. "She's been like this since day one," he said, sipping the coffee I'd poured him. "Controlling, yes, but also methodical. She never makes a move without stacking the deck first." He was on the original HOA board when Diane first ran for president. She came in with promises security, value appreciation, modernization. Within 6 months, she rewrote the bylaws to give more power to the board's executive branch. Then she filled the treasurer and vice president seats with people she could control. I raised an eyebrow. Marcus, her old intern, from her law firm days. She mentored him, groomed him, really? And Trevor Robert gave a dry laugh. Trevor was the icing on the cake. She didn't just want HOA control, she wanted a legacy, a project she could stamp her name on. The park was her crown jewel. So, why did you step down? His smile faded, because I told her the land didn't belong to the HOA, and she told me, quote, "We'll own it by the time it matters." I leaned back, cold settling into my spine. She believed no one would challenge her. I said, "She was right for 10 years, Robert replied, "until now." The cracks widen. The next morning, Sarah knocked on my door with 2 pieces of news. First, Nancy had resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. Her statement emailed to every resident cited irreconcilable ethical concerns and lack of transparency in HOA leadership. Second, a new thread had popped up in the Resurrected Community Forum. A resident named John Peterson, retired banker, early supporter of Diane, was demanding a full audit of HOA funds. By noon, the thread had over 80 comments. By 5 p.m., 5 more residents had publicly called for Diane's resignation. And by 7 p.m., a petition to suspend all HOA discretionary spending had reached 73 signatures, more than half the neighborhood. Diane responded at 9:22 p.m. with a mass email. These accusations are rooted in misinformation and orchestrated character attacks. I will not be resigning. The HOA board continues to function in full compliance with state law. But nobody believed her anymore. Leah's warning. Leah called me that night. Her voice was calm, but clipped. "You're about to cross a threshold," she said, "from a neighborhood dispute into a legal quagmire. Diane's pride is damaged. That makes her more dangerous, not less. She's already dangerous. Yes, but now she's desperate. What's our next move?" "We wait," she said. "Let the community turn against her. Then when the momentum is high, we file the formal complaint with the state's Department of Financial Institutions. If she's mishandled funds, they'll act. And the police. If we find falsified invoices or misused nonprofit filings, I'll loop in the district attorney." I hesitated. Do we have enough? We're getting there. But I want something undeniable. The HOA emergency meeting. The next evening, the HOA convened a special member meeting at the community clubhouse. The wording was vague, addressing recent confusion regarding land ownership and development planning. I walked in late, intentionally. The room was at capacity, close to 100 residents, many standing. Diane stood at the front with Marcus and Trevor at her side. She was still composed, still polished, but the confidence she once wore like armor had cracked around the edges. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is governed by HOA procedure. We will maintain order." She turned to a slide projected on the wall, a beautiful image of the forest trail with the title, "Silver Pines, a Vision for the Future." "This community has always looked forward," she began. "Yes, mistakes may have been made in communication, but our intent has always been—" "Intent is irrelevant," someone shouted from the back. "You lied to us?" Murmurs of agreement spread like fire. Diane flinched. "Please, let me explain." But another voice cut in. John Peterson. "You used our money to build a park on land the HOA doesn't own," he said. "You hired your husband's firm without disclosure." "That's fraud. That's nonsense," Trevor snapped. "Is it?" said Robert Jackson, standing slowly from the front row. "Because I was there 10 years ago, when Diane said we'd just take the land eventually." Silence dropped like a bomb. Trevor looked at Diane. Marcus looked at the floor. And then Nancy stepped forward from the crowd, holding a folder. "These," she said, placing them on the table, "are the invoices, the ledgers, the emails, all signed, all real, and all going to the Attorney General by the end of the week." The illusion finally shatters. Diane didn't respond. She didn't scream, didn't argue. She just stood there, frozen, blinking like someone realizing the spotlight had turned from admiration to exposure. Trevor turned and walked out. Marcus followed. Diane opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. For the first time, I saw her for what she really was. Not a tyrant, not a mastermind. Just a woman who had built an empire on assumption and intimidation, and now had no ground left to stand on. The final motion. John stepped forward again. I move that we suspend all current HOA projects and vote to initiate a full independent audit of all association funds from the past 5 years. Seconded, Nancy said. Hands shot up across the room. Only 3 stayed down. 2 days after the emergency HOA meeting, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Leah patched me through to Detective Alex Morgan, a financial crimes investigator with the county sheriff's office. His voice was clipped, precise, but not unfriendly. "Mr. Monroe," he said, "I've reviewed the files your attorney sent. We're opening a preliminary inquiry into the Silver Pines HOA. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the words settle. In particular," he continued, "we're concerned with the use of community-raised funds for development on land the HOA did not legally own, and the potential conflict of interest involving Green Vision Civic Design." "What happens next?" I asked. "We're going to request statements from relevant board members, quietly, for now. No formal charges yet. But if what you provided holds up under financial review, this won't stay internal for long." That was the moment I knew this wasn't a neighborhood feud anymore. This was a case. Fear sets in. By Friday, I noticed the shift. Diane's smile, always polished, always performative, was gone. Her front yard, once the model of immaculate HOA-approved landscaping, looked slightly unkempt. A couple of her signature hydrangeas had wilted. Marcus stopped jogging by my house. Trevor hadn't been seen in days. At the community bulletin board, someone had posted a notice in bold red: "We, the residents of Silver Pines, demand transparency, full audit, full accountability," signed by 87 residents. That same day, a moving truck parked outside John Peterson's house, not because he was leaving, but because he was clearing space in his garage for files and documents. He'd volunteered to store HOA records during the audit process. With Diane no longer trusted, the community had turned to the only person who still seemed neutral and willing. "I may be retired," John said when I stopped by to drop off extra boxes, "but I know how to read a ledger. And I know how to smell bullshit." The threat letter. That afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a typed note. "You've made your point. Back off before this gets uglier. HOA was never meant to be political. You're turning neighbors into enemies." There was no signature, but the envelope smelled faintly of perfume. Leah advised me to document it and not respond. They want you to get angry, reactive. Don't give them that satisfaction. But I wasn't angry. I was calculating. And calm, the way you get before a final push in a mission. The default balk, dust notices. The following Monday, we received confirmation the district attorney's office was reviewing the preliminary evidence forwarded by Detective Morgan. It wasn't a full-blown prosecution yet, but it was movement. The key issues under review: fraudulent fundraising, soliciting donations for a park on land the HOA didn't control; conflict of interest, awarding contracts to Green Vision Civic Design without disclosure; possible embezzlement, over $75,000 of community-raised funds poorly accounted for; unauthorized use of private land. For development, marketing, and fundraising, Leah was blunt. If the DA decides to move forward, Diane's going to need a real defense attorney, not just Marcus nodding behind her. Damage control. Too late. That week, Diane made a last-ditch effort. She emailed the neighborhood with a carefully worded apology. In hindsight, certain aspects of the Carter Nature Preserve initiative may have lacked full procedural transparency. I deeply regret any confusion and remain committed to serving this community in accordance with its values. It was the kind of statement written by someone trying to preempt legal liability. But it was too late. Nancy replied publicly with a copy of a board meeting transcript from 2 years prior, in which Diane had openly dismissed questions about ownership. "Frank Milner, he hasn't even set foot on that land in years. We'll handle it our way." Diane Carter. 2023 HOA Executive Session. When that hit the inboxes, everything changed. More residents came forward. One had donated $5,000. Another had helped fundraise. A third had printed the marketing flyers for free, thinking it was for a public good. And now, they were furious. The trespass trap. Meanwhile, I was still receiving subtle pushback. One morning, 3 of my private property, no trespassing signs were missing. Trail cameras revealed the culprits: Marcus, Trevor, and a third man I didn't recognize. I sent the photos to Detective Morgan. He responded in under an hour. "We'll log this. Tampering with posted signs on private property is a misdemeanor. Repeated offenses can elevate it. Good evidence. Don't engage. Let us handle it." Still, I could feel the pressure rising. They weren't just angry, they were cornered, and cornered people make desperate moves. An unexpected ally. 2 nights later, I got a message from someone I hadn't heard from in weeks. Karen Alvarez, the quiet neighbor across the street who had once warned me to tread lightly with Diane. Her message was short: "Meet me by the mailboxes." 8:30 p.m., no phones. When I arrived, she was already there, wrapped in a heavy coat, nervously looking around. "I can't stay long," she whispered. "But I want you to know Diane's trying to organize a block-wide protest. She's calling it a trail preservation walk. Says it's to reclaim the spirit of Silver Pines." I frowned. "On my land," Karen nodded. "Saturday morning. She's calling it peaceful. But some of the emails, they sound more like confrontation." I clenched my jaw. "Thanks for telling me." Karen hesitated, then added, "I've lived here 16 years. I believed in her. But not anymore." She turned to leave, then stopped. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she said. "You're fixing something we were too scared to face." And with that, she disappeared into the dark. Saturday morning came gray and still. I was up by 5:30, walking the border of my newly marked property in a heavy jacket, clipboard in hand. The new fence was up. The signs were clear, and the gate was secured with a coded lock. Attached beside it was a laminated document. "Notice: this land is private property, designated under Wildlife Conservation Permit, WWCP 2028. Unauthorized entry constitutes trespassing under RCW 9A 52.80. Jack Monroe, legal landowner." By 7:00 a.m., a few residents began to gather along the sidewalk just outside the woods. Most carried signs: "Trails belong to all. Access, not ownership. Jack is not our judge." I counted about 20 at first. By 8:00, there were closer to 40. And at the front, Diane Carter dressed like she was leading a charity hike. Fleece vest, pristine walking stick, and that signature look, polished, poised, and hungry for a camera. The walk that wasn't at 8. 15 sharp. Diane raised her voice. "Good morning, neighbors. We're here to remind Mr. Monroe and anyone else watching that community isn't about fences, it's about fellowship." She turned toward the gate. "This land may now have a new deed holder, but for us, it holds 10 years of memories. And that means something. Applause." She stepped toward the gate. Then 3 police cruisers pulled up. Detective Morgan stepped out first, flanked by 2 deputies. "Good morning, folks," he said, calm but firm. "This is an active private property boundary under legal dispute. Entry without permission will be considered trespass." Diane smiled sweetly. "We're simply walking, peacefully. There's no harm in presence." "Officer?" Morgan held up a folder. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the property line. You step past that fence, you're in violation. The landowner has requested law enforcement presence, and I advise you to reconsider." Diane turned back to the crowd, eyes narrowed. "You see," she said, "this is what we've become. A neighborhood where sharing is punished, where kindness is policed." She grabbed the gate's latch. I stepped forward. "Touch that, Diane, and I will press charges. Not as revenge, as protection." She hesitated, for the first time, truly uncertain. Community begins to fracture. The tension was thick. I could hear a woman near the back whisper, "Maybe he's right." A man next to her added, "I donated to that park. He's the only one showing paperwork." Diane heard it too. Her grip loosened, but it was already too late. Detective Morgan unfolded a printout. "For public record," he said, turning to the crowd. The development plan submitted under the Carter Nature Preserve proposal listed this land as community managed. That was false. The funds raised over $70,000 went to a firm owned by the HOA president's spouse. More murmurs, some gasps. We are now investigating misuse of community funds, undeclared conflict of interest, and attempted fraudulent development. Any continued activity on this land will be recorded as part of the investigation. Diane's voice cracked as she tried one last time. I did what I did for Silver Pines. You think this outsider cares about our future? I stepped forward. I care about the law, about honesty, about not being lied to by people hiding behind rules they break in private. I turned to the crowd. You were sold a lie, and I was nearly ruined for daring to point it out. The collapse. Diane released the gate and stepped back. No one clapped. In fact, no one followed her. One by one, people began to lower their signs. A few walked away entirely. The group dissolved not in violence, not in protest, but in disillusionment. I looked at Detective Morgan. He gave me a nod. That went better than expected, only because I had backup. I said, "Next week," he added. "We'll be bringing in financial auditors. You may be asked to testify. I'll be ready." He paused. "This kind of thing, it usually gets worse before it's over." "I know," I said, "but it's worth it." The last stand. That night, Diane sent one final email to the community. I hereby resign as HOA president effective immediately. I will not respond to further inquiries, as this matter is now being politicized and weaponized beyond reason. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply vanished along with Trevor, Marcus, and every shred of power they once held. But the damage was done. Yes, something better begins. 2 days later, an emergency election was held. Sarah Johnson, our local school teacher and longtime voice of reason, was elected interim HOA president. Her first act, request a third-party audit by a certified public accountant, published to the entire community. Her second appoint. Nancy Roberts and John Peterson to the Transparency Committee. Her third, she came to my house, handed me a proposal signed by 63 homeowners, and said, "We want your land to become a real community trail, legally, respectfully, on your terms." I read every word. At the bottom, I signed, and in that moment, Silver Pines stopped being a battleground. It started becoming a community again. The official charges came 12 days later. It started with a morning news article, HOA leadership under investigation for financial misconduct, headlined in the Valley Chronicle, with a subheader that named names former Silver Pines, HOA President Diane Carter, her husband, Trevor Carter, and Vice President Marcus Bell face inquiries involving misappropriation of funds, unauthorized land development, and conflict of interest. The article cited anonymous sources, leaked permit filings, and the audit Nancy and John had helped assemble. But the most important sentence came near the end. The County District Attorney's Office has confirmed that subpoenas have been issued and that a formal investigation is underway. The testimony. A week after the article, I was asked to appear at the sheriff's office for a formal statement. Leah accompanied me. She didn't speak much during the meeting, just sat with her legal pad and a quiet half-smile as I recounted everything. The fine, the hunting violation, the lies about the land, the attempts to coerce, discredit, and punish me. Detective Morgan was present, along with 2 financial investigators. They took notes, asked for clarifications, asked how I had discovered the HOA's fraudulent filings. I handed over the emails, the photos, the video stills of Marcus and Trevor removing signs, and the marketing brochures featuring Carter Nature Preserve stamped across what was now, indisputably, my land. One of the investigators looked up and said, "You realize, Mr. Monroe, this could very well lead to charges of wire fraud." I nodded. "If it does," I said, "it'll be the first time this neighborhood sees what accountability actually looks like." The fallout. By the end of the month, Diane and Trevor resigned from all community positions. Green Vision Civic Design, LLC was dissolved by court order pending financial audit. Marcus Bell was suspended from his administrative role at the city permit office. A temporary injunction was placed on all HOA spending until the audit completed. But the most satisfying part, the community, my neighbors, began to come forward, one by one, not with anger, but with thanks. Karen left a pie on my porch with a handwritten note. For standing up when we were too afraid to. We see you now. John Peterson handed me a check. Your property, your rules. But I want to help build something better on it. Even kids who had once been told by their parents to avoid the scary man on Maple Street now waved when they rode past my driveway. Silver Pines had changed. Not perfectly, but permanently. Legal closure. 6 weeks after my statement, Leah called me. They've offered plea deals. She said, probation, restitution, no jail time yet, but they'll have to pay back the misused funds and agree to never hold HOA or nonprofit financial positions again. I exhaled. Justice light. I muttered, maybe, she said, but public disgrace lasts longer than jail. She wasn't wrong. Diane Carter, once the queen of the community, was now a footnote. Her name removed from the trail signs. Her legacy replaced by something real, something earned. From property to purpose. With Sarah as the new HOA president, transparency became more than a word. Monthly meetings were actually attended. Budgets were published, decisions were voted on, and the land, we reached a formal agreement. I would retain full ownership and conservation control. A portion of the trails would be reopened with clearly marked boundaries. The HOA would fund basic maintenance with my oversight. And no one not now, not ever could name anything after a living board member. That was my only condition. I named the main trail the Frank Milner Path in honor of the man who trusted me with the land before anyone else did. The final letter, a month after the last of the legal dust settled, I sent one final email to the Silver Pines mailing list. It read, "When I moved here, I wanted peace and privacy. I found conflict and corruption, but I also found people willing to rebuild when the lies fell away. Thank you for your patience, your courage, and your eventual trust. The forest is open again, not to be claimed, but to be respected. Let's keep it that way." Jack Monroe. Closing of Chapter 5. As I watched the sun filter through the pines that afternoon, I thought about how easily people confuse authority with righteousness, how HOA policies can be weaponized, how silence becomes complicity, and how a man with no power, just a rifle, a deed, and the truth can still win, not just against a fine, but against a system. Peace, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with headlines or handshakes or dramatic speeches. It settled slowly, like morning fog across the forest floor, quiet, heavy, and almost unnoticed unless you were really looking. For the first time in months, I slept in until sunrise. No fines, no knocks, no new threats, just the rustling of leaves outside my window, and the low whistle of a chickadee hopping along the fence post. It felt earned. The quiet shift. Silver Pines didn't change overnight, but something in the air had shifted. Where once neighbors walked past my house with suspicion in their eyes, now they paused, hesitant at first, but warmer with each nod, each casual, "Good morning." Sarah Johnson stopped by that first week with a bottle of local wine and a folder. Inside the folder were 5 pages titled Silver Pines Community Listening Plan, including details on open forums, rotating neighborhood feedback committees, and an anonymous digital suggestion box. "We want real voices this time," she said. "Not just agendas, not just the loudest person in the room." I scanned the packet, then looked up. "You're really doing it," I said. She smiled. "We have to, or we risk becoming them again." I raised my glass. To starting over. What respect feels like. In the following days, I noticed a few changes I didn't expect. One morning, I found a family of 4 hiking on the new trail, the father pointing out different types of tree bark while the kids chased squirrels with giggles that echoed into the woods. They stuck to the path, didn't litter, even waved when they passed me sitting by the stream. Another afternoon, Nancy Roberts dropped by this time with no flash drive, no secrets, just a pie and a quiet thank you. "I've been able to breathe again," she said. "I didn't realize how heavy it had gotten until the weight was gone. I understood, entirely. Not because I was a hero, but because, for the first time in years, people in this neighborhood were starting to act like people, not roles in some fake social hierarchy. And it made all the difference. The legacy we choose. On the second Saturday of the month, we held a small trail dedication ceremony. No ribbon, no speeches, just a plaque, mounted on a wooden post, hand-carved by one of the teenage volunteers, the Frank Milner Trail, in memory of the man who left the woods better than he found them. Frank sent a video message from Florida. He was too old to travel, but his eyes lit up on the screen. "That land meant everything to my family," he said. "I never thought it'd mean something to yours. Too. Thank you for protecting it." After the video played, the crowd stood silent for a long moment. Then someone clapped, then someone else. Before long, the woods echoed with a quiet round of real, unscripted, grateful applause. Not for me, not even for Frank, but for the idea that we could build something better when ego got out of the way. Return to purpose. Later that week, I went back to my original hunting spot, not with a rifle this time, just a thermos, a pair of binoculars, and a folding chair. I watched a doe lead her fawn across the edge of the clearing, heard the distant bark of a fox, saw a hawk circle overhead, then glide down through the open air like a ribbon. No HOA notices, no angry voices, just wilderness and silence, and it hit me. I had finally become what I came here to be, just another man living in the woods. No drama, no titles, just roots and sky. It started with a knock on the door, not aggressive, not urgent, just steady and respectful. When I opened it, Sarah Johnson stood there with a folder under one arm and a cautious smile. "We have a proposal," she said, "and before you say anything, no, it's not about naming anything after me." That earned a rare laugh from me. She stepped inside and laid out the documents on my kitchen table. At the top, Community Nature Partnership Initiative Draft, Memorandum of Understanding, subheading. A cooperative plan for educational access and ecological stewardship on the Milner Forest lands. I raised an eyebrow. "Stewardship?" She nodded. "We're not trying to own it, just share it. With permission, legally, transparently, under your terms." The vision. The proposal included 3 major components. 1. A nature learning loop, a half-mile trail loop, open during school hours, with interpretive signs about native species, ecosystems, and land ethics. 2. Guided field access. Local teachers could schedule visits for biology and environmental science classes, supervised by certified guides. 3. Conservation agreements, no permanent structures, no development, no ownership claims, just a lease-to-access model tied to an annual conservation grant. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't political, and it didn't pretend the HOA deserved anything. It simply asked for collaboration, and in return, they'd give me what no one had offered before: respect, boundaries, and choice. Frank's wisdom. That night, I called Frank Milner in Florida. "Jack," he said, "saw the article about you in the Chronicle. You're quite the folk hero now." I chuckled. Not sure about that. More like the guy who didn't back down. We talked for a while about the land, the trail signs, the wildlife we'd both loved in different decades. Then I asked him what he thought about the proposal. He didn't answer right away. "You know what I miss the most," he said finally. "Watching kids find frogs in the creek. That feeling when they realize the woods are alive. If you can give them that without letting them ruin it, then it's worth doing. And if it costs peace, you didn't buy that land to hide from the world. Son, you bought it to protect it. That sometimes means letting people see it." A talk with Leah. 2 days later, Leah drove up from Portland. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, sipping coffee like old comrades between missions. I read the proposal. She said, "It's smart, carefully worded. They're not trying to trap you. I know. But opening the land means letting go of control. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. You fought like hell for the right to say no. Now you finally get to say yes to the right people. On your terms. That's not losing control. That's exercising it. I said nothing for a while. Then finally, I don't want a monument. You won't get one. She smiled. You'll get something better, a legacy you can walk through. The decision. The following Saturday, I met with Sarah and the new HOA committee at the trailhead. No suits, no banners, just printouts, maps, and open faces. I won't sign anything today, I said, but I'll say this, I'm willing. Their relief was visible, palpable. But there will be conditions, I added. Name them. Sarah said. I did. No motorized access. No political signage, ever. No renaming the land, trails, or clearings. Seasonal closures when wildlife needs time. And a conservation clause if any part of the HOA ever violates the agreement. Access is revoked permanently. They nodded, agreed, and just like that, something changed not just in the room, but in me. I wasn't defending anymore. I was building. The first step. Later that evening, I walked the main trail alone. I stopped at the clearing where I'd once stood over a clean buck, rifle in hand, thinking I was just a man escaping noise. Now the quiet felt different. It wasn't isolation, it was foundation. And beneath it all, the land hadn't changed. Only I had. The signing ceremony was intentionally small. No photographers, no ribbon cutting, just a folding table set up beneath a cedar tree at the trailhead, surrounded by half a dozen people who had chosen humility over headlines. Sarah brought her personal pen, one she said belonged to her grandmother, the first woman in their family to vote. Nancy brought coffee and homemade muffins. John Peterson, the ex-banker turned unlikely reformer, brought 2 witnesses and a copy of the newly audited HOA budget clean, published, and now pinned to the community board. I brought the deed. Leah was there too, standing to the side, arms crossed and smiling faintly as the last page was signed. With that, the Milner Forest Stewardship Agreement became official. A 20-year renewable contract, binding, transparent, revocable only by majority resident vote and owner consent. When I handed the signed copy to Sarah, she didn't speak. She just placed her hand over mine, firm and steady. For the record, she said softly, thank you for not walking away. The first footsteps. A week later, the first school group arrived, 15 kids from the local middle school, a mix of bright-eyed curiosity and preteen boredom. They were led by a new volunteer guide, Karen Alvarez, who had once stood silently behind Diane Carter, but now led confidently ahead. A clipboard in one hand and a snake identification sheet in the other. I stood off the trail, watching. At one point, a girl broke off to study a moss-covered log. She turned to her teacher and said, "It smells like rain and pine needles." And I thought, that's it. That's the entire reason. Not for praise, not for power, but for a sentence like that, pure, present, and real. Emily's return. A few days after the trail reopened, Emily Chen reappeared on my doorstep. Same notebook, same sharp eyes. "You owe me a final chapter," she said. "You won the war. Now when I poured coffee, we sat outside. I didn't win anything. I told her. I just stopped something that shouldn't have started. The rest, that's up to everyone else." She scribbled. "Do you trust them now?" she asked. I paused, looked out at the trees. I don't need to trust everyone. I just need to know they respect the rules. And I respect them. She nodded slowly. That's the story I'm writing. That maybe the real problem wasn't bad rules, but who was allowed to break them. She flipped to a new page. Final quote, I thought for a moment. Then gave her this, "Good fences make good neighbors. But better neighbors don't need fences at all." She smiled. Perfect. What remains? That night, I walked the forest alone one more time. No clipboard, no camera, just a thermos, the stars, and the feeling of ground beneath boots. At the same clearing where the war began, I stood still for a long while. A light breeze stirred the tall grass. Owls called in the distance. And in that silence, I finally understood I hadn't just reclaimed land. I'd reclaimed something deeper. The right to be left alone when I needed to be, and the right to belong when I chose to. No one talks about what comes after the war. The silence, the space, the uneasy question of what to do when the fight is over. For a long time, I didn't know how to answer it. I had bought land to escape noise and ended up at the center of a storm. But maybe that's the paradox of peace. You can't truly have it until you've defended the ground it stands on. I still walk the trail some mornings. Not for patrol, not for pride, just to listen. To the wind through pine, to the soft crush of boots on earth, to the distant chatter of kids pointing at owl feathers or deer tracks. No fences, no commands, just respect. And for me, that's enough. The HOA still meets monthly, but now it's boring, the way it should be. No power plays, no special projects, just landscaping budgets, safety updates, and the occasional lost cat. That's what order looks like when it's not built on fear. I'm no hero. I don't want to be one. But I learned something through this. Rules don't make a community. People do. And when rules are used to protect power instead of people, it's not order, it's oppression. But when power is shared, when ownership is honored and voices are heard, rules become something better. They become trust. Frank still writes me emails now and then, every time a new trail sign goes up, or a student sends in a drawing from their visit. I forward it to him. He always replies the same way. Looks like we did good, kid. I came here looking for quiet. I found something louder and better. I found a voice I didn't know I had, and a place that finally earned the name home. A free society isn't defined by how many rules it has, but by who those rules serve. Jack Monroe.